Hello and welcome to the second lecture for topic one. And in this lecture, we're going to be going over some key terms we're going to be using throughout the course of the semester. So here's a quick overview of what we're going to be learning about in this lecture. It's going to be a quick primer on some of the terms that we're going to be using throughout the course of this semester. So we're going to talk about and define what we mean by biological sex, by gender identity, gender roles and gender expression, and sexual orientation. So we'll go through the defining the terms using examples, and then at the end there will be just a short little quiz, not really a quiz, but a way for you to apply what you've learned. So let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so the first thing we're going to look at is biological sex. And what biological sex refers to is the anatomical characteristics of maleness and femaleness. And so when we think about anatomical characteristics, we're talking about the body, right? And so that human bodies have penises, they have testicles, they have vaginas, they have ovaries. Human bodies have chromosomes. XX are generally associated with having a vagina and ovaries. XY are generally associated with having a penis and testicles. And so when we think about biological sex, that a person will get a male or female designation that's associated with your anatomical characteristics. You are assigned a sex at birth. And so when the baby pops out, right, and then you look at the baby and the baby has a penis and testicles, right? Well, then it gets assigned male because its anatomical characteristics are those that are associated with biological maleness. If the baby pops out and has a vagina and ovaries on the inside, then they would be assigned female at birth. And so when we talk about sex, biological sex, we're usually talking about the designator of male or female. But as we know that the human body is more complicated than that. While most people are born XXXY, while most people are born with a penis and testicle or a vagina and ovaries, it's not always the case. And so that is where the concept of biological intersex comes into play. Biological intersex means that a person is born with physical characteristics that don't neatly fit into a binary notion of male or female bodies. And so that when it comes to genitals, that a person can be born with both ovaries and testicular tissue. An individual can have on the outside of their body, they could have a penis, but on the inside of their body, they could have testicles and a uterus. That there's chromosomes are not always just XX, XY. People can be born with XXY, and same with the hormones that are in an individual's body. And so that intersex is also biological sex. It's just sometimes people don't fit neatly into the male female binary that's often associated with biological sex. Okay, so let's move on to gender identity. What is gender identity? Gender identity is one's psychological or personal sense of oneself as having an identity of being a man, a woman, transgender, gender queer, being outside of the binary of man and woman. So gender identity is basically how you feel. That do you feel like a woman? Do you feel like a man? Do you not feel like either a man or a woman? Okay, so it's your psychological or your personal sense of oneself. You're probably familiar with some of the terms associated with gender identity. Cisgender is when your gender identity corresponds with your biological sex. And so if your biological sex is female, you have a vagina and ovaries, and that you feel like a woman, right? Then you would be cisgender. That your biological sex would correspond with your gender identity. And the term cis here is Latin for on the side of. Okay, so it's sort of like the biological sex is on the same side as one's gender identity, sense of yourself. Transgender is when your gender identity does not correspond with your biological sex, that you have a vagina and ovaries, but you don't feel like a woman, right? That's not your cycle. That's not what your identity is. And trans is Latin for on the other side of. And so that your biological sex is on the other side of your gender identity. You sort of think about a transatlantic flight. Transatlantic means that you go from, we think about that because it's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. You leave from New York City, you fly over the Atlantic Ocean, you go to England, it's a transatlantic flight on the other side of, okay? So transgender is when your biological sex doesn't identify or doesn't correspond with your own personal sense of oneself. Genderqueer or gender nonconforming means that your gender identity does not correspond with your masculine or feminine gender expressions. And so genderqueer, it can be that that when you think about who you are in terms of your gender, you don't feel like a woman, you don't feel like a man, you might feel like that there is that outside of those binaries, right? You might consider yourself gender non-binary, or you might consider yourself like genderqueer, like sometimes that the way you express yourself, your gender could be manifesting as masculine, sometimes it could be manifesting as feminine, that your gender identity is fluid and not fixed. Now here's two pictures of people that you might be familiar with from the news, or just from your consuming of popular media. On the left-hand side is Caitlyn Jenner. And Caitlyn Jenner used to be Bruce Jenner, an Olympian from the 1970s. But about 10 years ago, Bruce Jenner came out as Caitlyn Jenner and basically said that even though for most of their life, they have a penis, testicles, for most of the life they presented as a man, but that their psychological identity was not that their psychological identity was across from their biological sex. And so Caitlyn Jenner came out as a trans woman. Now, I put that Vanity Fair cover up there because it basically shows that that while Caitlyn Jenner identifies as a woman, the way that she expresses her gender is in a very sort of feminine terms, right? A bustier, long hair, sort of corresponding with gender sort of norms about what a woman looks like, right? And in a second, we're going to be talking about gender expression and gender norms. The other side here is Asian Kate Dillon. You may be familiar with them. That they were on the show Orange is the New Black. Also, they're on the show Billions. That's where I was introduced to Asia Kate Dillon. And they play Taylor Mason on Billions. And that Asian Kate Dillon was assigned female at birth, but their gender identity is gender non-binary, okay? And so I put this up here because it shows sort of the difference in the multiplicity of how we think about gender identity and also how we express our gender identity, right? So Caitlyn Jenner expresses their gender identity in a very feminine way. Asian Kate Dillon expresses their gender identity in a very sort of non-binary way. combining both gender expressions of male or masculine, feminine, blurred, and somewhere in between, right? And so it just sort of gives you an indication, not that y'all don't already know about this, about sort of just the diversity as it relates to gender identity. Let's move on now to talk about gender roles and gender expressions. And we're going to start with gender expressions. Gender expression is how a person expresses their gender, okay? In other words, that if you feel like a woman, how do you express that gender to the world? If you feel like a man, how to express that gender to the world? If you don't feel like either, how do you express that gender to the world, okay? And so gender expression is how a person expresses their gender. Masculinity and femininity are on the far end of the spectrum, right? The idea that masculinity and femininity are the qualities that are considered characteristics of women, that would be femininity, or qualities considered characteristics of men, and that would be masculinity. We're going to be talking about this in our discussion this week. Particularly with Roxane Gay, she talks a lot about like, is she a feminist because she does embrace some, femininity in terms of her gender expression. And so when you sort of think in extreme stereotypes, like the characteristics of women are, meek, cry a lot, wear dresses, heels, lace, fancy hairdos or whatever. Gender expressions of being a man, right? Wearing flannel, work boots, right? Like using chainsaws all the time. I don't know. They're just silly, right? Exaggerations. But there is a sense of masculinity. What does a real woman look like? Or that got it backwards. Femininity, what does a real woman look like? And masculinity, what does a real man look like? Okay. Now, when it comes to gender expression, kind of what we were talking about, that if you don't feel like you are a woman or a man, but you feel agender, non-binary, or genderqueer, the way you express yourself would, you'd have a gender expression, right? It'd be the qualities considered characteristics of neither men or women, both, etc., right? And so going back to Asia, Kate Dillon, who considers themselves non-binary, they express themselves in that way, in a fluid way, neither identified as the characteristics of being a man or being a woman. Now, when it comes to gender roles are the social expectations for how men and women should behave, right? And so in a way, gender expression is a part of gender roles, right? That women should dress a certain way, that men should dress a certain way. So if you see men wearing things that aren't considered masculine, that it calls into question maybe, the social expectations about what a man should look like. But gender roles go beyond just how you express yourself visually and otherwise. But they're sort of the social expectations for how men and women should behave. And behaving is, dressing is a part of behavior. But there's other behaviors that fall into gender roles and gender, these social expectations regarding the roles that men, women, and others should play. And so, women should be the primary caretaker for children. That's an expression of gender roles. The job of the president of the United States is a job for a man, right? That's an example of a gender role. And it might seem like, who the heck would say that the job of the president of the United States is a job for a man? Well, listening to interviews with people who didn't want to vote for Hillary Clinton, a frequent comment that people would make is that, ultimately the job is, the president's job is a job that should be one for men. So the gender roles, and the social expectations are still alive and well today in the 21st century. No surprise there. Okay, the last thing we're going to talk about here is sexual orientation. And what sexual orientation is one's physical or emotional attraction to a gender. And so that if you are physically attracted to men, women, physically attracted to both men and women, not physically attracted to either men or women, physically attracted to all sorts of gender identities, right? Then there's a certain, sort of label or moniker that goes with that. If somebody is gay, that usually means that they identify as their gender identity is a man and they want to have sex with other men. If you're lesbian, your gender identity is a woman and you want to have sex with other women. If you're straight and your gender identity is man, you want to have sex with women. Women, straight, you want to have sex with men. Bisexual, if you're a man, you feel comfortable having sex with men and women. Asexual, you don't want to have sex with anybody. Pansexual is where you might identify as non-binary and that you are sexually attracted to a whole array of gender identities. Asian Kate Dillon identifies as pansexual, as part of it, as an example of that. So sexual orientation, bottom line, is like who you are emotionally and physically attracted to. Okay, here's the silly quiz at the end of the lecture. Giving you an opportunity of applying concepts, asking yourself, is this an issue dealing with primarily with sex, biological sex, gender identity, gender roles, or sexual orientation? The first one is, I need to go to my primary care physician to get a pap smear, a testicular exam, or maybe both. Does that deal with biological sex, gender identity, gender roles, or sexual orientation? And I think the best answer there is biological sex, okay? Humans are born with certain anatomy, and that anatomy is often considered what your sex is. And so if you are born female, then you probably have a uterus. You're going to need to have your cervical, area, have a pap smear to make sure that there's not cancer there. If you have testicles, born male, likely to have testicles, right? Get a testicular exam. But you could also be born with both the uterus and testicular, tissue. You might need both. Later in the semester, we're going to be reading about transgender men who still have biological sex capacities to have children, and the difficulty with trans men and trans women for getting the health care that they need, given the biases and just obstacles that trans men and women face when it comes to getting the medical care that they need as it relates to their anatomy. How about this one? When I see that person, it really makes my heart go pitter patter. I want to kiss them. Okay. Well, if the person that you want, that has to do with your sexual orientation, like who you are emotionally attracted to. Okay. And so if you're a man and you see a man and your heart goes pitter patter and you only get pitter patter when you see other men, well, then you're going to be gay. But if you see another person, you identify as a woman, and you see either a man or a woman and your heart goes pitter patter, bisexual, right? Sexual orientation. How about this one? Is this biological sex, gender identity, gender roles, or sexual orientation? As a new father, I really want to take family leave to bond with my newborn, but I'm afraid about how that will be perceived by my colleagues at work. It's gender roles, right? That as a man, a father, sense that men are supposed to be breadwinners, working all the time, that raising kids, that's women's work, but maybe you really want to bond with your kids, as should all parents, right? And so the sense that what you want is contrary to what the expectations are has to do with gender roles. I know I have female body parts, but I don't really feel like a woman. Which one is that? Gender identity. Well, no lecture on all of these key terms is complete without taking a look at the genderbread person. Get it? Not gingerbread, but genderbread. What's cool about this is really this entity right here, and that talks about identity. So gender identity talks about attraction, sexual orientation or attraction. Talks about sex, you get your parts right there, and then on the outside, gender expression, how you present yourself to the world. And that it basically shows that the different spectrums from when it comes to gender identity, identifying as a woman or a man, or being not feeling like you have a gender identity. Gender expression on the far end, masculine or feminine; on the other end, agender. When it comes to biological sex, the anatomical representation of what it means to be a female, femaleness, maleness, or asex on the other side. And attraction, right? And so, as we've talked about, this sort of fluid binary of who and you are attracted to. All right, thanks a lot for listening. Hope that was clear. If you have any questions, just drop me an email or a text or show up to office hours, and I'd be more than happy to help you figure things out. Okay, talk to you later.